I thought I could replace him. I really did. That was before I realized some people leave marks you can't just erase, no matter how hard you try. And I'm not talking about scars or memories, at least, not the kind you can put in a box and forget. I'm talking about the way someone can occupy a corner of your chest, a quiet, impossible corner, even when you've sworn you're over it. I was leaning over the counter at Harper's bookshop, thumbing through the latest mystery novels, when she walked in. Her heels clicked softly on the wooden floor, just enough to puncture the hum of quiet customers and the rustle of pages. I noticed her first, not because she demanded attention, she didn't, but because she had this air of confidence that didn't need to shout. She moved like she knew exactly where she belonged, and for some reason, it made me aware of how unsure I still felt about myself. She glanced at me once, a brief, deliberate look that lasted maybe a second too long, and I felt my chest tighten. I forced myself to look back at the shelf, pretending the spines of the books were more interesting than the electricity that had just crackled across that glance. She wasn't young like me, there was something in the lines of her face, the way her hands moved, that said she'd been through storms and had learned which ones were worth weathering. "Do you have the latest Collins?" she asked, her voice calm, measured, almost teasing, though I couldn't tell if it was intentional. Her hand rested on the edge of the counter, knuckles lightly tapping. The small gesture, the tilt of her wrist, the way she leaned slightly forward, was unsettling. In a way I couldn't articulate, I wanted to memorize it. I nodded, fumbling with the shelf behind the counter. Yeah, it should be." My voice cracked somewhere near the middle, and I cursed silently. She didn't comment, she just watched, a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of her lips. That tiny smile made me feel like I'd just failed a test I didn't know I was taking. When I handed her the book, our fingers brushed. I wanted to pull back, but I couldn't. There was a warmth, subtle and human, that lingered in that accidental touch. She didn't flinch, she didn't do anything overt. She just held the book a little tighter, angled her body slightly toward me, and said, "Thank you." Just that. But in that single word, in the way her eyes met mine, I felt something. Something I wasn't supposed to feel. She lingered just a moment longer, scanning the shelf behind me as if looking for something she didn't need, and I found myself watching the curve of her neck, the way the light caught her hair. It was absurd, and I hated that I was noticing, that I wanted to. But the thought wouldn't let go. She left the shop moments later, but the image of her hand brushing against mine stayed. Later, when I was alone stacking books, I realized my chest still ached a little, like a phantom limb I didn't know I had. I kept thinking about the tilt of her head, that small smile, and the warmth of her touch. Nothing happened between us, not yet. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. About her. About how someone I'd barely spoken to could already feel so impossible to forget. And that was the beginning, the spark of something unspoken that I knew, deep down, I wasn't ready for, but also couldn't resist. It was 2 days later when our paths crossed again. This time, it wasn't chance, or maybe it was, in a way that felt cruelly deliberate. She had a copy of the Collins book in one hand and a stack of old manuscripts in the other, clearly juggling more than she needed to. I offered to help. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice steady, but I caught the slightest tremor, a hesitation in the lift of her brow. Something about that flicker made me stop short. She didn't often look uncertain. "I've got it," I said, taking a few of the papers from her hands. The weight was heavier than I expected, and she didn't pull back, she just allowed it, her eyes flicking up to mine for a brief, loaded moment before dropping back to the floor. She moved with precision, but there was a subtle fatigue around her shoulders, a small slump I could only notice because I was watching. Her hands, long and capable, trembled slightly as she rearranged the books on the counter, the knuckles pale from gripping too tightly. I wanted to reach out, tell her to rest, but I didn't. I wasn't supposed to. Thanks, she murmured, almost inaudible, the words brushing past me like a secret. I noticed the faint laugh that escaped her lips when she tried to correct a misplaced manuscript, a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was soft, but it struck a chord somewhere deep, a resonance I didn't have the right to acknowledge. I realized then that she wasn't just busy, she was carrying something heavier than these papers. The quiet lines around her eyes, the way she paused before answering questions, the slight tilt of her head when she thought she wasn't being watched, all of it spoke of someone who had learned to guard herself. I didn't know what her life looked like outside these walls, but I knew I could spend hours trying to decipher the smallest traces of it she left behind. For my part, I tried to stay inconspicuous, hovering at the edge of her space, doing tasks she hadn't asked me to, just to be near her without being invasive. I kept noticing her, the way she tucked stray strands of hair behind her ear, the faint scent of coffee on her sleeve, the restless tapping of her foot against the floor when she thought no one was looking. When she finally straightened and took a breath, leaning for a moment against the counter, I noticed her hands, slightly reddened from handling the papers, fingers flexing as if testing for strength. She looked tired, not in the kind of way that could be solved with a nap, but the kind that hinted at too many late nights, too many responsibilities. My chest tightened, and I found myself wanting to shoulder a fraction of her weight. She glanced at me, and I swear there was a flicker there, something unspoken, fragile, that made her eyes soften for a split second before she masked it with her usual careful composure. I returned her gaze, letting it linger, just enough for the moment to stretch between us, taut with something neither of us could name. She didn't speak. I didn't either. We simply stood there, side by side, the stack of manuscripts between us like an invisible line we weren't supposed to cross, yet it felt as if the air itself was holding its breath. And then she smiled, a small, almost reluctant curve of her lips, and my pulse caught in my throat. That one fleeting expression carried more weight than words could, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been quietly pulled into something forbidden, something fragile, something dangerous. Something I was already unwilling to resist. The shop was quieter than usual that evening. The rain had started in earnest, hammering against the windows in a rhythm that felt like it belonged to some old, forgotten song. We were the only ones left, shelves half-stocked, the scent of damp earth seeping through the slightly open door. She was rearranging a pile of leather-bound journals near the corner, and I offered to help, though I didn't need a reason to be near her. "Careful with that one, it's older than I am," she said, half teasing, half warning, her lips twitching in a small, unreadable smile. I leaned closer to steady the journal in her hands, just close enough that our arms brushed. She didn't pull away, not immediately, and the warmth of her skin against mine was sharp, almost unbearable. For a moment, the room shrank around us. The rain, the dim light, the muted hum of the heater, they all felt like they existed just to frame this one tiny, impossible moment. My throat went dry, and I wanted to say something clever or gentle, something that could anchor us both, but my voice caught somewhere in my chest. I wasn't expecting it to be this old, I said finally, fumbling with the journal. She gave a short laugh, low and warm, and my stomach twisted at how naturally her amusement reached me. Then her phone buzzed on the counter, and the spell broke. She glanced at it, a flash of tension crossing her face before she quickly masked it. "I didn't ask, you didn't want to, but I saw the name on the screen reflected in the windowpane, Mark." Something tightened in my chest. I wasn't supposed to feel threatened by this, but I did. A tiny, irrational stab of jealousy. She set the journal down, fingers lingering on the edge as she answered, murmuring something about picking up tomorrow, her voice careful, measured. I stayed a step back, pretending to organize other shelves, though I could hear the faint hitch in her tone when she said goodbye. When she hung up, she leaned back against the counter, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized she was holding. Her eyes met mine for just a second, long enough for me to notice the subtle tremor of exhaustion there, the way her shoulders sagged, the faint shadow under her eyes from sleepless nights. "I'm sorry," she said softly, almost to herself. "It's nothing." But the pause before and after those words screamed otherwise. I didn't respond. I didn't have the right. I just lingered near enough to feel the heat of her presence, to let her know I was here if she needed it. She picked up the journal again, but this time our hands brushed just a fraction longer. My fingers tingled, and for a heartbeat, the idea of holding her hand, even lightly, hovered in my mind like a dangerous thought I couldn't unthink. The storm rattled the windows. The heater hummed low. I wanted to reach out, to let her feel what I was feeling, but something held me back, some invisible boundary I couldn't cross, some respect I didn't want to violate. And yet, as she looked up at me with a fleeting, almost imperceptible softness, I knew we were both acutely aware of what might have happened. Instead, I straightened the stack of journals, my fingers brushing against hers one last time before stepping back. The tension lingered, unspoken, palpable, and I couldn't stop thinking about the tiny shock of proximity, how it made the world feel smaller, sharper, impossibly charged. For a moment, I swore I felt the edge of something neither of us were ready to name, a pull that was already reshaping the space between us. And when the thunder rolled, I realized I would remember that brush forever. The shop was nearly empty again, the evening sunlight filtering through rain-streaked windows in pale, muted stripes. She sat on a low stool, legs crossed, her hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm tea. I stood nearby, pretending to straighten a shelf, but every movement felt loud in the quiet room. "You've been quiet," she said suddenly, voice low, not accusatory, but careful. I froze mid-motion, the corner of the shelf almost tipping over. She didn't flinch at my startled glance. Instead, she leaned back, as if bracing herself, her eyes fixed somewhere behind me. I guess I stopped. What could I say that wouldn't make me sound like an idiot? Like a kid trying to articulate a storm he barely understands? I swallowed. "You're thinking about something you shouldn't," she said softly. Not a reprimand, not quite a question, just an observation. She took a sip of her tea, but her fingers shook slightly, betraying her attempt at composure. I wanted to reach for her hand. Not for a touch, really, but just to let her know I saw her, really saw her in the way no one else seemed to. But I didn't. My hands stayed at my sides, knuckles tight, pretending I was busy with the shelf. "What are we doing?" she said finally, the words barely more than a whisper, but they cut through the silence like a blade. She didn't look at me directly, but I felt the weight of her gaze, the unspoken plea to answer, to explain, to justify whatever strange gravity had pulled us into this orbit. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in my throat. I couldn't explain it to her. I couldn't even explain it to myself. I only knew that every glance, every accidental touch, every shared moment made the world shrink down to the space between us, and it terrified me. She exhaled slowly, a shudder in her shoulders that I couldn't ignore. "This isn't normal," she said. Her voice cracked just slightly, a microfracture of vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to show before. And there it was, the real her, unguarded, human, a little broken. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that I understood, but instead I just stepped closer, not touching, not speaking, just existing in the same space. We looked at each other like that for a long time. No words. No movement. Just silence, loud and impossible. I felt her breath, soft and uneven, saw her fingers clutching the mug like it was a lifeline. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't about curiosity, or a fleeting attraction, or even desire. This was something deeper, messier, more dangerous. She finally shifted, setting the mug down, and looked at me fully. Her eyes were glistening, the faintest tremor of unshed tears, and she whispered, almost to herself, "I don't know how to not care about you." The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with confession neither of us knew how to hold. And in that moment, I felt the impossible weight of everything unspoken, everything we couldn't yet act on, pressing down on us both, and I knew nothing would ever feel normal again. I wasn't expecting her to talk about it. Not tonight, not in the soft hum of the shop with the rain still tapping against the windows. But she did, in that way that made her seem both fragile and impossibly strong at once. I lost someone once, she said quietly, voice low and careful, almost like she was testing the air to see if it could handle the weight of the words. She didn't look at me as she said it, fingers idly tracing the rim of her coffee cup. It's been years, but sometimes, it still feels like yesterday. I swallowed, unsure whether to speak or just stay silent. There was nothing I could say to make it better. Nothing that could erase the raw edge in her tone or the way her eyes softened as she stared off into the corner of the shop, somewhere far beyond the walls. What happened? I asked finally, almost whispering, careful not to push. She hesitated, and I could see the tiny shiver run through her shoulders, the way she was holding herself together by force. He left, she said. Not in anger, not even bitterness. Just matter of fact, like stating a fact that shouldn't exist. She let out a small breath, one that carried more exhaustion than I'd realized she'd been hiding. And then I had to figure out how to keep going without pretending it didn't hurt. For some reason, her words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to tell her that she wasn't alone, that whatever pain lingered didn't have to be carried by just her. But I stayed still, keeping my hands on the counter, letting her words sink in, letting the weight of them settle between us. Then my phone buzzed, an alert I wasn't supposed to check, a message I hadn't meant to see, but the image it displayed made me catch my breath. A picture of her from years ago, smiling beside someone I could see had mattered to her more than she ever admitted. My fingers tingled as I realized the resemblance, the echo of a love lost, reflected in her eyes even now. She noticed me staring, and instead of masking anything, she just let herself be still. For the first time, I felt the full scope of what she'd carried all these years, the quiet scars, the weight she'd kept invisible. My chest ached with something I couldn't define, protectiveness, longing, guilt, all rolled into a tight knot that refused to loosen. I don't talk about him, she whispered, almost like she was confessing a sin. Her gaze met mine briefly, fleeting, and then she looked away again, cheeks faintly flushed. I wanted to reach for her hand, to brush it lightly, to reassure her without speaking, but the invisible line between us held firm. And yet, something had shifted. That image, her words, the tremor in her voice, it was as if the air itself had changed, carrying a subtle charge I hadn't felt before. My chest tightened, my pulse quickened, and I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for her to look at me again, waiting for permission to step closer into this quiet, fragile moment. She finally lifted her eyes, and I saw it, a flash of something unguarded, something almost desperate that hadn't been there before. A tiny exhale, almost a surrender. And I knew, without a word, that nothing between us could ever be the same. The evening air was warm with the faint scent of rain drying on the pavement outside. The shop was nearly empty, but we didn't move. She was perched on a low stool again, knees drawn close, fingers fiddling with the edge of a book. I stayed nearby, leaning against the counter, pretending to organize things but really just watching her. "This feels different," she said softly, almost to herself. Her voice carried a weight that wasn't quite sadness, not quite fear, but something fragile and honest that made the world outside the shop fade away. I didn't answer immediately. I didn't need to. She glanced up, eyes meeting mine, and in that moment I realized that the distance we'd kept, the careful boundaries, the unspoken rules, we'd both stopped following them. Something had shifted so subtly that it felt inevitable. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a declaration. It was the quiet acknowledgement of a truth neither of us had been ready to name aloud until now. You've changed the way I see, she trailed off, letting the sentence hang in the air, incomplete but somehow complete enough. Her hands twitched slightly, brushing against the book she held, restless and honest. I took a careful step closer, careful not to startle her, and let my hand hover near hers. She didn't pull back. Instead, she shifted slightly, allowing the faintest brush of our fingers, a touch so slight it could have been accidental, yet charged enough that I felt it travel straight to my chest. It wasn't a spark or a flame. It was a confirmation. A quiet seal on all the tension, longing, and fragile connection we'd built over weeks of near misses and stolen moments. I let my hand rest lightly on hers, not pressing, not claiming, just there, sharing space, sharing warmth, sharing a fragile intimacy neither of us needed to label. She exhaled softly, a tiny, shuddering laugh escaping her lips, and I felt the tight coil of my chest loosen, if only a little. We stayed like that for minutes that stretched into something timeless. Her head tilted slightly, almost unconsciously, and our eyes met again, full of understanding, unspoken permission, and the quiet resolve that whatever this was, we would navigate it together. No rush. No dramatic confession. Just presence, awareness, and the subtle certainty that neither of us could, or wanted to, go back to before. Finally, she leaned back against the stool, letting her fingers linger lightly against mine, and whispered, "I don't think I can pretend this isn't real." I smiled faintly, not a victory smile, not a triumph, just a soft acknowledgement, and squeezed her hand gently. "Neither can I said, and meant it in the quietest, most permanent way possible. We didn't say anything more. There was no need. The space between us hummed with a calm inevitability, like the world had tilted slightly and left us both in this shared orbit. And in that gentle, earned silence, I realized we didn't need words to define it. We didn't need declarations to validate it. It was there. Quiet. Steady. True. It's strange, looking back from here, knowing how much could have gone wrong and yet how perfectly it didn't. I still remember the way her fingers brushed against mine that first night when the air between us changed, the faint tremor in her laugh, the quiet, impossible moments that built into something neither of us could ignore. I've learned that love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks or grand gestures. Sometimes, it grows in the spaces you don't notice at first, the shared silences, the hesitant glances, the unspoken confessions carried in a sigh or a brush of skin. And sometimes, it demands patience, self-restraint, and the courage to exist alongside someone fully, without knowing how the world will judge you. She's changed too, though in ways subtler than I can always describe. I see it in the way she allows herself to pause, to lean on me just slightly, to laugh fully without pulling it back. She carries a kind of quiet strength now, a gentleness for herself that wasn't there before. And me? I've learned that the heart can expand in ways you don't predict, that the people who touch you most deeply aren't always those you expect, or those who enter your life at the right age. We still live in the same world with the same complications, the same responsibilities, but now there's a thread connecting us, taut and unbreakable, invisible but felt in every shared glance, every pause, every careful touch. It's not perfect. It's real. And somehow, that makes it more remarkable than any fairy tale I could have imagined. Sometimes I think about how it began, with a look, a tremor in her fingers, the faintest brush of warmth, and I marvel at how slowly, almost imperceptibly, everything shifted. From cautious distance to hesitant curiosity, to understanding, to shared silence that spoke louder than any words could. That's where the beauty lies, in the evolution, in the small, human moments that aren't flashy or dramatic, but leave you forever changed. And now, when I see her smile across the room, when our hands meet without thought, I know we've earned this. Not because it was easy, but because it was worth waiting for, worth navigating the pauses, the doubts, and the quiet storms that tested us. I guess what I've learned is that love, real, messy, human love, doesn't demand perfection. It demands patience, honesty, and courage. And sometimes, it demands simply being present, even when everything in you wants to run. We sit together now, often in silence, often talking about nothing at all, but it's enough. Enough to know, enough to feel, enough to trust that the thread between us will hold. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?